The economy line is over there.
Victoria's voice sliced through the terminal like a blade finding bone. Raymond didn't move.
This section is reserved for first-class passengers only.
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna need you to step aside.
I have a ticket.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah? But first class requires more than a printed pass. We have verification standards.
Run the scan. You'll find what you need.
Hey, I don't want to cause a scene.
Then don't cause one.
Victoria blinked. No one spoke to her like that. Not here. Not in her terminal. She straightened, clicked 2 fingers toward her colleague. Sarah, come here, please. Sarah Mitchell approached from the adjacent counter, her smile cautious, her eyes already reading the room. Does this boarding pass look right to you? Victoria held it up like evidence. Sarah examined it. Her brow softened. It's legitimate. Seat 3A. Black card payment. Fully verified. Cards can be stolen. Victoria, call it in, please. Raymond looked at Sarah with a patience that said he had done this before. Been here before. Stood in this exact spot, steady silent, waiting for a system to catch up to what he already knew. Sarah started typing. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. Victoria, she said carefully, the system shows no flags, no alerts, no reason to, I said, call it in. Now. Before we go any further into what happened at that counter, I need you to do something for me. Look at what just played out. A man, a ticket, every verification passed. And yet, if you've ever walked into a room and immediately felt like someone had already decided you didn't belong, drop your city in the comments right now. You're not alone in this. And if you believe that dignity shouldn't come with a dress code, hit subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to see what happens next. Because what Raymond Thompson carried that day wasn't just a worn leather suitcase. It was 30 years of patience, and that patience was about to run out. Take us back to the moment it began. Not the confrontation, not the camera phones, not the phone call that would bring Victoria Sterling's entire world crashing down. Back to Raymond Thompson, 42 years old, standing at the entrance of Miami International Airport, carrying his father's suitcase. Raymond Thompson, 42 years old with kind eyes and graying temples, wore a faded leather jacket that had seen better years, well-worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers that told stories of countless miles. Everything about his appearance whispered ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable. Everything except his posture. He stood with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Victoria Sterling, on the other hand, looked like she had stepped out of a corporate fashion magazine. At 35, she commanded attention with platinum blonde hair swept into a flawless updo, a form-fitting navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's rent, a pencil skirt that hugged her curves perfectly, and designer heels that clicked against the polished floor like a countdown timer. She was elegant, sophisticated, and absolutely certain that appearances told the whole story. I'm sorry, there must be some confusion. Victoria continued, her voice dripping with professional politeness that barely masked her irritation. Our first-class check-in is reserved for premium passengers. The main terminal has plenty of space for... She paused, letting her eyes travel from Raymond's face to his jacket, to his suitcase for travelers with more standard accommodations. Raymond reached into his jacket pocket without a word and withdrew his boarding pass. He placed it on the polished marble counter with the same care someone might use to place a chess piece in checkmate. The pass was real legitimate first-class seat 2A. Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly as she picked up the boarding pass with 2 fingers, holding it like it might contaminate her manicured nails. She studied it for a long moment, then looked at Raymond again, then back at the pass. Her expression shifted from dismissive confidence to cautious suspicion. "This is interesting," she said, her voice carrying a new edge. "Sarah, could you come over here for a moment?" Sarah Mitchell, 31, with brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wearing the standard Prestige Airlines uniform, approached from the adjacent counter where she had been helping an elderly couple. Her smile was genuine, the kind that came from someone who actually enjoyed helping people, but it faltered slightly when she saw the tension crackling between Victoria and Raymond. "What can I help you with, Victoria?" Sarah asked. "I need you to look at this boarding pass," Victoria said, never taking her eyes off Raymond. "Does anything seem unusual to you?" Sarah took the pass and examined it. Her brow furrowed slightly. "It looks legitimate to me. First class C2A paid in full. The system shows." "The system can be fooled," Victoria interrupted. "People print fake passes all the time. Look at him, Sarah. Does he look like someone who belongs in first class?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. Around them, the normal sounds of airport life continued, rolling luggage announcements over the PA system, children asking their parents when they would board. But in this small space around the Prestige Airlines counter, everything had gone very quiet. Diego Martinez, 28, with kind eyes and strong hands marked by years of honest work, had been loading luggage onto a nearby cart when he heard Victoria's voice rise. As a baggage handler, he was used to being invisible, just another pair of hands moving things from point A to point B. But something in Victoria's tone made him pause. He had heard that tone before, and it never led anywhere good. From his position 30 feet away, Diego watched as Raymond stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression calm but alert. Diego had worked at Miami International for 6 years, long enough to recognize trouble brewing, and long enough to know that it usually started with assumptions about people who didn't look like they belonged. "Ma'am," Sarah said carefully, the boarding pass scanned correctly. "His name matches his ID, and the payment went through our system without any flags. I don't see any reason to call security," Victoria said. The words dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the gathering crowd. A businessman in an expensive suit lowered his Wall Street Journal. A family with 3 young children turned to stare. A college student with her laptop bag pulled out her phone. "Victoria, I really don't think that's necessary," Sarah said, her voice dropping to what she hoped was a reasonable whisper. But Victoria Sterling had made up her mind, and when Victoria Sterling made up her mind, she didn't change it. She had been promoted to head of customer experience 8 months ago, and in that time, she had built a reputation for maintaining what she called standards. Those standards included keeping undesirable elements away from their premium services, maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that first-class passengers paid for, and ensuring that Prestige Airlines remained prestigious. "Security," she called out, her voice carrying across the terminal. "We need security at first-class check-in. We may have a fraudulent ticket situation." Raymond finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "There's no fraud here, just prejudice." Victoria's cheeks flushed pink beneath her carefully applied foundation. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. You're creating a disturbance." "I haven't raised my voice," Raymond replied. "I've barely spoken at all." Amy Rodriguez, 26, with nervous energy and a customer service badge that still felt new on her uniform, had been watching the scene unfold from the information desk. She was young enough to still believe that fairness mattered, and inexperienced enough to think that speaking up would make a difference. She approached the counter with hesitant steps. "Ms. Sterling," she said quietly, "I processed a similar first-class ticket earlier. This gentleman's pass looks identical to—" Amy Victoria's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "This doesn't concern you. Please return to your station." But Amy didn't move. Something about the way Raymond stood there dignified and patient while Victoria called security on him for the crime of not looking wealthy enough reminded her of her own father. Her dad worked construction, came home tired and dirty. Every day wore old clothes because new ones would just get ruined. But he was a good man, an honest man, and he deserved respect regardless of what he wore. "It does concern me," Amy said, her voice growing stronger. "Customer service is everyone's concern, and this customer hasn't done anything wrong." Victoria's jaw tightened. In her 8 months as head of customer experience, she had worked hard to establish her authority to make sure that standards were maintained, and that the wrong sort of people understood they weren't welcome in premium spaces. She had dealt with similar situations before, and they always ended the same way. The person with the fake ticket or stolen card or whatever scam they were running would back down when faced with real consequences. Raymond Thompson was not backing down. James Wilson, 45, with graying hair and 22 years of security experience, approached the counter with the measured pace of a man who had seen every kind of airport drama imaginable. He wore the crisp uniform of airport security, complete with radio badge and the kind of tired expression that came from dealing with human nature at its worst on a daily basis. "What seems to be the problem here?" James asked, his voice neutral and professional. Victoria straightened her posture and put on her most authoritative voice. "This gentleman is attempting to use what appears to be a fraudulent first-class boarding pass." When questioned, he became defensive and refused to provide additional verification. Raymond looked at James with steady eyes. "I presented a legitimate boarding pass and valid identification. I've answered every question asked of me. I haven't raised my voice or made any threats. My only crime appears to be not meeting this woman's expectations of what a first-class passenger should look like." James looked at the boarding pass in Victoria's hand, then at Raymond, then at the small crowd that had begun to gather. In 22 years of airport security, he had learned to read situations quickly, and this one felt different from the usual scams and cons he dealt with. For one thing, the man wasn't acting guilty. He wasn't nervous, wasn't trying to talk his way out of anything, wasn't making excuses. He was just standing there calm as a lake before dawn, waiting for the storm to pass. Sir James said to Raymond, "May I see your identification?" Raymond reached into his wallet and withdrew his driver's license, handing it to James with the same steady calm he had shown throughout the encounter. James examined it carefully, comparing the photo to Raymond's face, checking the expiration date, looking for any signs of tampering. "This appears to be legitimate," James said. "Appears to be," Victoria repeated. "But people can fake IDs, too. Look at that suitcase, look at his clothes. Does this look like someone who can afford a first-class ticket that costs more than most people make in a week?" And there it was. The truth that had been lurking beneath Victoria's professional politeness and security concerns. It wasn't about fraud or fake tickets or airport safety. It was about a worn leather suitcase and faded jeans, and the assumption that poverty was criminal and wealth was virtue. The college student with the laptop bag had been recording with her phone for the past 3 minutes. Her name was Jennifer Park, and she was a communications major at University of Miami with 15,000 followers on TikTok and a sense of justice that burned like a small bright flame in her chest. "This is being recorded," Jennifer said, her voice carrying across the space. "Everyone can see what's happening here." Victoria's eyes flicked toward the phone, then back to Raymond. "Recording or not, we have policies to protect our premium passengers from fraud and disruption." "Show me the policy," Raymond said quietly. "What?" "Show me the policy that says worn luggage equals suspicious behavior. Show me the training manual that teaches your staff to question passengers based on their appearance. Show me the procedures that allow you to call security on someone for looking poor." Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. Around them, the crowd was growing. The businessman with the Wall Street Journal had taken out his own phone. The family with 3 children watched with wide eyes. Diego had abandoned his luggage cart entirely and moved closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sarah Mitchell looked at her supervisor, then at Raymond, then at the boarding pass still in Victoria's hand. She had worked for Prestige Airlines for 4 years, and in all that time, she had never seen Victoria look uncertain. But right now, for just a moment, Victoria Sterling looked like a woman who had just realized she might have made a very big mistake. "Sir Victoria," said her voice regaining some of its earlier confidence, "if you have nothing to hide, you won't mind if we verify your payment method and conduct a brief security screening." Raymond smiled for the first time since the encounter began. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile that sharks might wear if sharks could smile. "I don't mind at all," he said. "But first let me make a phone call." Victoria Sterling felt a small flutter of unease as Raymond Thompson reached for his phone, but she pushed it down with the same determination she used to push down any doubt about her decisions. In her 8 months as head of customer experience, she had built her reputation on maintaining standards, and standards meant that people who looked like they belonged in economy stayed in economy. "Sir, you can make your phone call after we've resolved this security concern." Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been challenged and didn't intend to start now. Raymond looked at her with those calm, steady eyes that had never wavered throughout the encounter. "Actually, I think I'll make it now." He pressed a number on his phone and raised it to his ear. Around them, the crowd continued to grow. Jennifer Park kept recording her phone, capturing every word and expression. Diego Martinez had moved even closer, close enough to hear everything, his jaw tight with anger at what he was witnessing. Elena Raymond said into the phone, his voice just loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "It's Raymond. I'm at Terminal 3 Prestige Airlines first-class check-in. We have a situation." Victoria scoffed, a sound of pure derision. "Elena, let me guess, your lawyer, your bail bondsman." She looked around at the crowd playing to them like an actress on stage. "People, this is how these scams work. They have accomplices, people who pretend to be an authority. Don't be fooled." But something in Raymond's tone, something in the way he stood there completely unbothered by her accusations, made James Wilson take a step closer. In 22 years of security work, he had developed an instinct for reading people, and every instinct he had was telling him that Raymond Thompson was not what he appeared to be. Sarah Mitchell watched her supervisor with growing concern. She had known Victoria for 8 months, had watched her implement new policies and procedures that always seemed to result in certain types of passengers being directed away from premium services. She had filed 2 reports about these incidents with HR reports that had been filed and forgotten without any follow-up. Amy Rodriguez stood behind the information desk, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the scene unfold. She had been working at the airport for only 6 months, but she had already seen enough to know that this was wrong, all wrong, and that someone needed to speak up. Elena Raymond continued. "I'm experiencing discrimination at the Prestige Airlines counter. The staff has called security because they don't believe I belong in first class. Yes, I know. No, I haven't identified myself yet. I wanted to see how far this would go." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Discrimination. Sir, I'm following standard security procedures. We have every right to verify suspicious activity, and your entire presentation here is suspicious. That suitcase looks like it came from a garage sale." Raymond lowered his phone and looked directly at Victoria. "This suitcase belonged to my father. He carried it for 30 years traveling for work, carrying his dreams and his hopes and everything he owned. It has more miles on it than most pilots." How touching, Victoria said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But sentimental value doesn't pay for first-class tickets." "Sarah, have you been able to verify his payment method?" Sarah looked at her computer screen, then at Victoria, then at Raymond. The payment shows as processed successfully. American Express Black Card verified and approved. No flags in the system, no unusual activity. Victoria's expression flickered for just a moment. An American Express Black Card required either a $10,000 annual fee or an invitation based on extraordinary spending. It wasn't the kind of card that came with fraudulent tickets or garage sale suitcases. Cards can be stolen, she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Diego Martinez had heard enough. He stepped forward, his uniform marking him as airport staff, his anger marking him as someone who had reached his limit. "Ma'am," Diego said, his voice respectful but firm. "I've been working this airport for 6 years. I've seen real security threats, real problems, real fraud. This isn't it. This is just a man trying to catch a flight and y'all are treating him like a criminal because his luggage isn't shiny enough." Victoria whirled on Diego with the fury of someone whose authority had been challenged by what she considered an inferior. "Excuse me, who are you?" "Exactly. Baggage handlers don't make security decisions. Please return to your duties and let the professionals handle this." "Professionals?" Diego's voice rose slightly. "Professional? What professional discrimination? Because that's what this looks like from where I'm standing." The crowd murmured its agreement. Jennifer Park continued recording her followers, now watching live as the situation escalated. The businessman with the Wall Street Journal had put down his paper entirely and was watching with the focused attention of someone who recognized a pivotal moment when he saw one. Raymond raised his phone again. "Elena, they're escalating. The baggage handler just called them out and now they're attacking him too. Yes, I think it's time." Victoria laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. "Time for what? Time for your accomplice to show up and pretend to be someone important. People don't fall for this. These scams are sophisticated now. They use multiple people, fake authority figures, even insider knowledge." James Wilson had been listening carefully to both sides, watching body language, reading the room. Raymond Thompson stood like a man telling the truth. Victoria Sterling sounded like a woman trying to convince herself she was right. And the longer this went on, the more certain James became that he was witnessing something that would end badly for one of them. Ms. Sterling James said carefully, "Perhaps we should take a step back here. The gentleman's documentation appears legitimate. His payment has been verified, and he hasn't made any threats or disturbances. Maybe we should—" "Are you kidding me?" Victoria's voice rose to a pitch that carried across half the terminal. "Security is supposed to support airline staff, not question our judgment. I am the head of customer experience for Prestige Airlines, and I'm telling you that this situation is suspicious." Amy Rodriguez couldn't stay silent any longer. She left her post at the information desk and walked over to the group her customer service training, warring with her sense of right and wrong. "Ms. Sterling Amy," said, her voice shaking, but determined, "I've processed over 200 first-class passengers in the past month. This gentleman's documentation is identical to theirs. The only difference is what Amy Victoria's voice was dangerous, now the tone of a superior who was about to make an employee's life very difficult. Amy looked at Raymond, at his calm dignity in the face of this public humiliation, and found her courage. "The only difference is what he looks like." The crowd went completely silent. Even the normal background noise of the airport seemed to fade, as those words hung in the air like a confession, like an accusation, like a truth that everyone could see, but no one had been willing to say. Victoria's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "That is completely inappropriate and absolutely false. I make decisions based on security protocols and airline policy, not on what Raymond asked quietly, not on what Miss Sterling Victoria realized she had been about to say something that would end her career, so she clamped her mouth shut and pointed at Raymond with a perfectly manicured finger that shook slightly with rage. "Security," she called out, her voice carrying across the terminal. "I need this man removed from first-class check-in immediately. He's disrupting operations and making other passengers uncomfortable." But as James Wilson looked around at the crowd, he saw something different. The other passengers weren't uncomfortable with Raymond. They were uncomfortable with Victoria. They were shifting away from her, not him. They were recording her, not him. And they were murmuring among themselves with the kind of disapproval usually reserved for people who cut in line or talked loudly on their phones. Raymond looked at his phone as it buzzed with a text message. He read it, smiled slightly, and put the phone back in his pocket. "Ms. Sterling," he said, "in about 30 seconds, you're going to receive a phone call. I suggest you answer it." Victoria looked at him like he had lost his mind. "What kind of nonsense are you?" Her phone rang. It was her work phone, the one connected to the airline's internal system, the one that only rang when someone from corporate headquarters or airport administration needed to reach her immediately. She looked at the caller ID, frowned, and answered. "Victoria, Sterling Customer Experience." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and carried the kind of authority that made seasoned managers sit up straight and pay attention. "Ms. Sterling, this is Elena Vasquez from Airport Operations. I need you to listen very carefully. You are currently involved in an incident with a passenger named Raymond Thompson. Is that correct?" Victoria's eyes flicked to Raymond, who was watching her with those steady, calm eyes that seemed to see everything. "Yes, we have a suspected fraud situation involving—" "Miss Sterling," the voice interrupted, "you need to stop talking and start listening. Raymond Thompson is not a fraud. He is not a security threat. He is not someone you want to continue harassing. Do you understand me?" Victoria felt the first real stab of fear pierce through her anger and certainty. The voice on the phone carried the kind of authority that could end careers with a single phone call. Who exactly am I speaking with?" Victoria asked. "I told you. Elena Vasquez, Airport Operations Director. And Raymond Thompson is my boss." The phone slipped from Victoria's suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered to the marble floor. The sound of Victoria's phone hitting the marble floor echoed through the terminal like a gunshot. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nobody moved. Victoria stared down at her phone as if it might bite her if she tried to pick it up. Raymond stood perfectly still, his expression unchanged, waiting. Around them, the crowd had grown to nearly 50 people. Passengers who had been heading to other gates had stopped to watch the drama unfold. Airport employees had paused in their duties. Even children seemed to sense that something important was happening and had stopped asking their parents about boarding times. Jennifer Park's live stream now had over 2,000 viewers, the number climbing rapidly as people shared the video with comments like, "You won't believe what's happening at Miami Airport," and "This is insane, watch this." Victoria bent down slowly and picked up her phone with shaking hands. She could hear Elena Vasquez's voice still coming through the speaker, tinny and distant, but unmistakably authoritative. "Ms. Sterling. Ms. Sterling, are you there?" Victoria raised the phone to her ear with movements that looked like they belonged to someone in a dream or a nightmare. I'm here," she whispered. "Good. Now, I need you to listen very carefully. You are going to apologize to Mr. Thompson. You are going to process his ticket immediately and without any further delay. You are going to treat him with the respect that every passenger deserves. And then you are going to report to my office in Terminal Administration. Do you understand?" Victoria looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route or someone who might tell her this was all an elaborate joke. But she found only staring faces recording phones, and Raymond Thompson watching her with an expression that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. This doesn't make sense," Victoria said into the phone. "Who is he? Who is Raymond Thompson?" Mr. Thompson. Elena's voice came through clearly enough for several people in the crowd to hear owns this airport. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She actually staggered backward, her designer heels clicking against the marble as she fought to maintain her balance. The color drained from her face so completely that her carefully applied makeup stood out like war paint on a surrender flag. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered. Diego Martinez, who had been watching the scene with growing satisfaction, couldn't help himself. He started laughing, a rich, deep sound full of justice and vindication. "Lady, you just called security on the man who signs the paychecks." Sarah Mitchell put her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. She had watched Victoria Sterling discriminate against passengers for months, had filed complaints that went nowhere, had tried to speak up and been shut down. And now it was all crashing down in the most public way possible. Amy Rodriguez felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. Relief that someone with actual authority had finally seen what was happening. Terror that she might be caught up in whatever consequences were about to rain down on everyone involved. James Wilson, with 22 years of experience reading situations, had the sudden clear realization that he was witnessing a career-ending moment. Not his own, he had followed procedures and tried to de-escalate. But Victoria Sterling's career was over, finished, done. She just didn't know it yet. Raymond finally moved. He stepped forward and gently took the phone from Victoria's unresisting hand. "Elena," he said, "thank you. I think we have enough documentation now." "How much did you record, sir?" "I wasn't recording." "But our friend here was." Raymond nodded toward Jennifer Park, who was still holding her phone up, still streaming live to an audience that had grown to over 5,000 viewers. "And about 40 other people have been capturing various angles. I think we have sufficient evidence." Victoria stared at Raymond as if seeing him for the first time. This man she had dismissed, insulted, and humiliated was speaking with the casual authority of someone who made decisions that affected thousands of people's lives. His voice had changed to still quiet, but now carrying an undertone of power that made everyone around him lean in to listen. You really own the airport?" Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. Raymond looked at her for a long moment. "I own the company that owns the airport, yes. Miami International Airport Holdings. You might have seen it on your paychecks if you bothered to look. But why? Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Raymond's expression hardened. "Because passengers shouldn't need to be airport owners to receive basic human dignity. Because a man with a worn suitcase shouldn't have to prove his worth to get the service he paid for. Because what you did to me, you've been doing to other people who don't have my resources or authority to fight back." The truth of his words hit Victoria like cold water. She had been so confident, so certain that she was protecting Prestige Airlines standards, maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that premium passengers expected. But standing there surrounded by witnesses and cameras looking at the calm dignity of the man she had tried to humiliate, she began to understand what she had really been doing. I was trying to maintain standards," she said weakly. "Whose standards?" Raymond asked. "Standards that say a person's value is determined by the newness of their luggage. Standards that assume poverty is criminal. Standards that treat human beings as problems to be managed rather than customers to be served." Diego stepped forward again. "Sir, if I may, this isn't the first time. I've watched her do this before. 3 times in the last month I've seen her redirect passengers who looked like they might not belong. Always the same type of passenger, if you know what I mean." Raymond turned to Diego with interest. "What's your name?" "Diego Martinez, sir." "Baggage handling." "How long have you worked here, Diego?" 6 years, sir." "And in those 6 years, how often have you seen this type of redirection?" Diego looked at Victoria, then back at Raymond. More often since she got promoted to head of customer experience. A lot more often. Victoria's remaining composure cracked completely. That's not, you don't understand the pressures I'm under. Premium passengers expect a certain environment, a certain type of what Miss Sterling Raymond's voice was quiet, but it carried the force of judgment. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. Whatever she had been about to say would only make things worse. Every word that came out of her mouth seemed to dig the hole deeper to provide more evidence of exactly what Raymond was accusing her of. Amy Rodriguez found her voice again. "Mr. Thompson, sir, I filed complaints about incidents like this. Twice. Nothing ever happened." Raymond turned those steady eyes on Amy. What kind of incidents? Passengers being asked for additional verification when their documentation was already complete, being directed to economy check-in even when they had premium tickets, being told that certain services weren't available when they clearly were. And these complaints went where to HR to management. They said they would investigate, but nothing happened. Raymond finished. "No, sir. Nothing happened." Raymond looked around at the crowd, at the phones still recording, at the faces watching this confrontation with fascination and horror. Then he looked back at Victoria Sterling, who stood there in her designer clothes and perfect makeup, her authority crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. Ms. Sterling Raymond said, his voice carrying across the terminal so clearly that even people 50 feet away could hear every word, "You are fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises, and you will never set foot in this airport again as an employee or contractor." Victoria's knees buckled slightly. "You can't. I have rights. There are procedures." "There are indeed procedures," Raymond agreed, "and will follow every one of them. But right now, your access is revoked, your employment is terminated, and your career in this industry is over." He turned to the crowd, many of whom were still recording. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to break it down completely and build it back up. This airport will do better. We will be better. And incidents like this will never happen again." The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Diego clapped loudest of all, his face split by a grin of pure satisfaction. Sarah Mitchell applauded with tears in her eyes. Amy Rodriguez clapped with hands that no longer shook, and Victoria Sterling stood in the center of it all, surrounded by the wreckage of her career and the consequences of her choices, finally understanding that dignity and respect couldn't be bought with designer clothes or authority, and that sometimes justice came wearing faded jeans and carrying an old suitcase full of truth. The applause was still echoing through Terminal 3 when Raymond Thompson's phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a call he was making. It was a call coming in. He glanced at the screen, smiled slightly, and answered without stepping away from the crowd. "Elena, I assume you've been monitoring the situation." Elena Vasquez's voice came through the phone clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Her tone was crisp, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone who managed complex operations on a daily basis. "Sir, I've been watching the live streams and monitoring internal communications. We have 47 recorded angles of the incident, and it's already trending on 3 social media platforms. More importantly, this has triggered the comprehensive review protocol you established last year." Victoria Sterling, still standing in shock from being fired moments earlier, felt a new wave of confusion wash over her. Comprehensive review protocol. What kind of operation was Raymond Thompson running? Raymond nodded to the phone. "Initiate Phase 7, Elena. Full lockdown and assessment. I want every department head in the main conference room in 30 minutes, and I want a complete audit of customer service incidents for the past 12 months. Already underway, sir." I've also taken the liberty of contacting Dr. Patricia Morales from the University of Miami's Business Ethics Department. She's agreed to conduct an independent assessment of our service protocols. Diego Martinez, who was still processing the fact that the man he'd defended was actually his ultimate boss, stepped closer. "Sir, if I may, there are things the department heads need to know. Things that have been happening that maybe haven't made it up the chain of command." Raymond looked at Diego with interest. "What kind of things?" Mr. Martinez. Diego glanced around at the crowd at the phones, still recording at Victoria's pale face. "Maybe we should talk privately, sir." "No," Raymond said firmly. "Privacy is how problems like this grow in the dark. If you have something to say about how this airport operates, say it here now, where everyone can hear it." Diego took a deep breath, looked once more at Victoria, and began to speak. "Sir, what happened here today? This isn't new. It's been going on for months. Ever since Ms. Sterling got promoted to head of customer experience, there's been a pattern. Certain passengers get flagged for additional screening, get their documentation questioned, get directed away from premium services." "What do you mean by certain passengers?" Raymond asked, though. His tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Passengers who don't look like they belong in first class," Diego said. "Black passengers, Latino passengers, passengers wearing clothes that don't look expensive enough. I've watched it happen dozens of times." Jennifer Park, still streaming live to an audience that had grown to over 8,000 viewers, moved closer to capture Diego's words. The comments on her stream were flying by too fast to read. "This is insane." Good for him. She got what she deserved. Airport discrimination is real. Sarah Mitchell found her voice again. "Diego's right, sir. I've tried to speak up about it, but Ms. Sterling said she was implementing enhanced security measures to protect the premium passenger experience." "Enhanced security measures," Raymond repeated. "Explain that to me." Sarah looked at Victoria, who was still standing in stunned silence, then back at Raymond. "Passengers who didn't meet certain appearance standards were subjected to additional verification. Extra questions about payment methods, more thorough documentation checks requests for secondary identification. And these appearance standards were what exactly?" "Informal," Sarah said carefully. "Nothing in writing. But the message was clear. If someone looked like they might not belong in first class, we were supposed to make sure they really belonged there." Amy Rodriguez stepped forward from her position near the information desk. "Sir, I documented some of these incidents. I kept notes because something felt wrong about them. Would you like to see them?" Raymond nodded, and Amy pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her notes and began reading. October 15th. Black businessman questioned about stolen credit card despite providing valid ID and boarding pass. Ms. Sterling required additional verification that delayed his boarding by 20 minutes. November 2nd, Latina woman with premium ticket asked to provide proof of employment because her ticket was unusually expensive for someone of her apparent means. November the 18th, elderly black gentleman asked to move to economy check-in because his first-class ticket seemed suspicious. With each incident, Amy described, the crowd's murmur grew louder. Phones continued recording from multiple angles. James Wilson, the security supervisor, looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized he had been called to respond to similar security concerns multiple times over the past few months. "Mr. Wilson," Raymond said, turning to the security supervisor, "how many of these enhanced security checks have you been asked to respond to?" James shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we respond to calls from airline staff when they identify potential security concerns. I'd estimate maybe 15 to 20 calls specifically from Ms. Sterling's area over the past 3 months, and how many of those calls resulted in actual security issues, fraud, stolen tickets, genuine threats." James was quiet for a long moment. "None, sir. 0. Every passenger we checked had legitimate documentation and valid reasons for being where they were. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Victoria Sterling, who had been silent since Raymond fired her, finally found her voice. "I was protecting the airline," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "Premium passengers pay extra for an exclusive experience. They don't want to feel like they're in a discount airline. There's nothing wrong with maintaining standards." Raymond turned to her with the kind of look that could freeze fire. "Ms. Sterling, you're no longer an employee of this airport or any company operating within it. You have no standing to defend policies you're no longer authorized to implement. Security will escort you out now." But before James could move to escort Victoria away, Raymond held up a hand. "Actually, let's do this differently. Ms. Sterling, since you're so confident in your policies, let's examine them more closely." Elena's voice came through the phone speaker again. "Sir, I have the documentation ready. Over the past 8 months since Ms. Sterling's promotion, customer complaints about discriminatory treatment have increased by 340%. Specifically, complaints alleging racial profiling have gone from an average of 2 per month to an average of 15 per month." The crowd gasped. Victoria's face went pale again. Furthermore, Elena continued, internal employee complaints about discriminatory policies have increased by 280%. "We have 14 formal complaints filed with HR regarding Ms. Sterling's direction to profile passengers based on appearance." "What happened to those HR complaints?" Raymond asked. "They were reviewed by Regional Manager Robert Blake and HR Director Patricia Hayes. All 14 complaints were classified as unsubstantiated concerns about standard security procedures and were filed without further action." Raymond was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then he spoke into the phone with the kind of calm that preceded earthquakes. "Elena, I want Robert Blake and Patricia Hayes in the conference room in 20 minutes. I want their files, I want the HR complaint records, and I want their explanations for why organized discrimination was classified as standard security procedures." "Already done, sir. They're en route." Victoria staggered slightly as the full scope of what was happening began to sink in. This wasn't just about her firing. This was about everyone who had enabled, supported, or covered up her policies. This was about the entire structure that had allowed discrimination to flourish in the name of standards and security. Diego stepped forward again. "Sir, there's something else you should know. Ms. Sterling didn't just implement these policies on her own. She had meetings with other department heads, talked about maintaining brand consistency and passenger expectations." "Which department heads?" "Customer relations, premium services, and terminal operations." They all knew what was happening. Raymond looked around at the crowd, which had grown to nearly 100 people now. Airport employees, passengers, security personnel, airline staff from other companies, all watching as the organized dismantling of institutional discrimination played out in real time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Raymond said, his voice carrying across the terminal, "what you're witnessing today is not just the firing of one employee. You're witnessing the complete overhaul of a culture that has allowed prejudice to masquerade as policy and discrimination to hide behind standards." He turned back to his phone. "Elena, initiate Code 7 protocols across all terminals. I want every department that interfaces with passengers reviewed, every policy that could be used for discriminatory purposes examined, and every employee who has been complicit in these practices identified." Sir, Code 7 affects approximately 2,000 employees across 6 terminals. Are you certain you want to implement it during peak travel hours? Raymond looked around at the faces surrounding him, some hopeful, some nervous, some still recording everything on their phones. He thought about his father, who had worked at this very airport for 30 years, cleaning floors and emptying trash cans and being treated as invisible by people who thought his uniform made him less than human. He thought about all the passengers who had been humiliated and turned away simply for not looking wealthy enough. He thought about the employees who had tried to speak up and been silenced. Elena, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Implement Code 7. Full review, full transparency, full accountability. And let every news outlet in South Florida know that they're welcome to cover what happens next. Understood, sir. Code 7 is now active. Raymond hung up the phone and looked directly at Victoria Sterling, who was still standing there in her designer clothes, surrounded by the wreckage of her career and her worldview. Ms. Sterling, you asked me earlier why I didn't identify myself immediately. It's because I wanted to see exactly how you treated passengers who couldn't fight back. I wanted to experience firsthand the culture you had created. And now, everyone else has seen it too. He turned to the crowd. In 1 hour, this airport will begin the most comprehensive reform of passenger services in its 50-year history. Not because we were caught, but because silence is complicity, and tolerance of intolerance is participation in injustice. The applause that erupted was different from before, not just appreciation for justice served, but hope for justice to come. The applause was still echoing through Terminal 3 when the sound of rapid footsteps approached from the direction of the administration offices. Elena Vasquez appeared through the crowd like a force of nature, a 40-year-old Hispanic woman with steel gray streaking her black hair, and the kind of presence that made seasoned airport managers straighten their shoulders and check their watches. She wore a crisp navy suit that was professional without being pretentious, carried a tablet computer that looked like it contained the secrets of the universe, and moved with the efficient grace of someone who managed one of the busiest airports in the world on a daily basis. "Mr. Thompson," she said as she approached, her voice carrying the respect of a trusted lieutenant speaking to a commanding officer. "I have the preliminary reports you requested." The crowd, which had begun to disperse slightly immediately, pressed closer again. Jennifer Park's live stream was now pulling in over 12,000 viewers, with comments flooding in faster than anyone could read them. Other passengers had started their own streams, creating multiple angles of what was rapidly becoming the most public corporate reform in aviation history. Elena's presence seemed to make everything that had happened before feel suddenly, dramatically real. Here was confirmation that Raymond Thompson wasn't running an elaborate con, wasn't pretending to be someone he wasn't trying to intimidate his way out of a problem. Here was his second-in-command treating him with the deference reserved for actual authority, carrying actual documents that would have actual consequences for real people. Victoria Sterling, who had been standing in shocked silence since her termination, watched Elena's arrival with growing horror. This was really happening. The man she had humiliated and tried to have removed from first-class check-in really was her boss's boss. And now his operations director was standing right there with what looked like evidence of everything Victoria had tried to hide. Elena Raymond said, his voice still calm, but carrying new undertones of executive authority. "Please brief everyone present on what your initial review has found." Elena looked around at the crowd, passengers, employees, security personnel, people with phones recording everything, and then looked back at Raymond with a slight raise of her eyebrow. "Sir, are you certain you want this information made public before we've had a chance to review it internally?" Raymond nodded firmly. "The time for internal review has passed, Elena. These problems grew in darkness and secrecy. They'll be solved in sunlight and transparency." Elena nodded and opened her tablet. "Very well. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Elena Vasquez, Operations Director for Miami International Airport Holdings. For the past 45 minutes while you've been witnessing the incident at this check-in counter, my team has been conducting a rapid review of passenger service protocols across all terminals." She touched her tablet and began reading. "In the 8 months since Victoria Sterling was promoted to Head of Customer Experience for Prestige Airlines, our Passenger Advocacy Office has received 127 formal complaints alleging discriminatory treatment at premium service counters. 89% of these complaints involved passengers of color who were questioned, delayed, or redirected, despite having valid documentation and payment. The crowd murmured, some in shock, some in anger, some in recognition. Diego Martinez shook his head and muttered, "I knew it was more than what I'd seen personally." Elena continued. Of these 127 complaints, only 12 were elevated to management review. Of those 12, 0 resulted in corrective action against staff members. Instead, passengers who complained were often flagged in internal systems as difficult or potentially problematic. Sarah Mitchell gasped audibly. That's why some passengers seemed familiar when they came back. They were being watched, exactly, Elena confirmed. Ms. Sterling implemented an informal tracking system for passengers who filed complaints. These passengers were subjected to additional scrutiny on return visits, essentially punishing them for speaking up about discrimination. Victoria finally found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "That's not... I was trying to prevent future incidents. It was customer service management." Elena looked at Victoria with the kind of professional distance usually reserved for problems that needed to be efficiently resolved. "Ms. Sterling, your methods have been documented through multiple channels. We have audio recordings of staff meetings where you instructed employees to use visual cues to assess passenger legitimacy. We have email communications where you described certain passengers as inconsistent with brand expectations. And we have testimony from 14 employees who were directed to implement what you called elevated verification procedures for passengers who didn't meet appearance standards." Amy Rodriguez stepped forward, her phone in her hand. "I recorded some of those staff meetings. I hoped someone would eventually want to hear what was actually being said." Raymond turned to Amy with interest. "You recorded the meetings?" "Yes, sir. I was uncomfortable with the policies being implemented, and I wanted documentation in case..." She gestured around at the crowd at the cameras at the aftermath of what had just happened. "In case this happened." "May we hear some of those recordings?" Raymond asked. Amy nodded and scrolled through her phone. She found a recording labeled Staff Meeting, November 15th, and hit play. Victoria's voice came through, clearly addressing what sounded like a room full of people. "People, we need to be realistic about our clientele. Premium passengers pay premium prices for a premium experience. That means they expect a certain environment, a certain standard of fellow passengers. When someone shows up looking like they bought their clothes at a thrift store and carrying luggage from 1975, that affects the atmosphere we're trying to create." The recording continued, with Victoria's voice becoming more specific. "I'm not saying we discriminate, but we can certainly ensure that people who don't meet our standards understand what those standards are. Ask additional questions. Request extra verification. Make sure they really belong in premium services before we allow them to impact the experience of passengers who clearly do belong." The silence that followed the recording was deafening. Even the normal background noise of the airport seemed to fade as everyone processed what they had just heard. It wasn't ambiguous or subtle. It was explicit instruction to discriminate based on appearance, delivered with the authority of management and the expectation of compliance. James Wilson, the security supervisor, looked physically ill. "Ms. Sterling, I responded to dozens of calls from your department. You told me these were legitimate security concerns." "They were security concerns," Victoria said desperately. "Appearance-based assessment is a recognized security protocol. Behavioral indicators include..." "Stop," Raymond said, his voice cutting through Victoria's attempt at justification like a blade through silk. "Ms. Sterling, every word you say right now is being recorded by dozens of phones and will be used as evidence in the discrimination lawsuits that are about to be filed. I strongly suggest you remain silent." Elena consulted her tablet again. Sir, our legal department has confirmed that we have sufficient evidence for immediate termination of Ms. Sterling under company anti-discrimination policies. Additionally, Regional Manager Robert Blake and HR Director Patricia Hayes have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation of their role in suppressing employee complaints. The crowd stirred at this news. Victoria looked around desperately as if searching for someone who might support her, someone who might agree that her policies had been reasonable and necessary. She found only faces looking back at her with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. Diego Martinez stepped forward again. "Sir, if I may," it wasn't just Ms. Sterling. Customer Relations Manager Janet Webb held a meeting last month where she told us that certain types of passengers required enhanced attention to prevent brand dilution. Elena made notes on her tablet. "Mr. Martinez, would you be willing to provide a formal statement about that meeting?" "Yes, ma'am." "And I'm not the only one who was there." A woman in her 50s wearing an airline uniform raised her hand tentatively. "I was in that meeting, too." Janet Webb said that passengers who looked inconsistent with our market positioning should be guided toward more appropriate service levels. More hands went up. More voices spoke up. What had started as one woman's discriminatory policies was revealing itself to be a much larger, more organized effort to exclude certain passengers from premium services based on race appearance and perceived economic status. Raymond listened to each testimony with the same calm attention he had shown throughout the entire incident. But those who watched closely could see something building behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold determination that was far more dangerous than rage. Elena Raymond said when the testimonies had concluded how many employees have been implicated in these practices. Elena consulted her tablet. Direct involvement or knowledge, 47 employees across 6 departments. Administrative knowledge or willful ignorance, an additional 31 employees in management and supervisory roles. And how many passengers have been affected? Conservative estimate based on documented incidents over 300 passengers in the past 8 months. Realistic estimate including undocumented incidents likely over 800. The numbers hit the crowd like physical blows. 800 passengers. 800 people who had paid for services they were qualified to receive, who had been judged, questioned, delayed, and humiliated based on nothing more than their appearance. 800 instances of discrimination disguised as customer service. Victoria Sterling finally broke down completely. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her voice cracking with tears and desperation. "I was trying to maintain standards. Premium passengers expect to be treated with dignity and respect." Raymond interrupted. "They expect the same dignity and respect that every passenger deserves, regardless of what they look like or what they're wearing. What they don't expect is to be part of a system that excludes and humiliates people based on prejudice." He turned to address the crowd, many of whom were still recording everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing today is not just the end of one woman's discriminatory practices. You're witnessing the beginning of comprehensive reform that will ensure this never happens again." Elena stepped forward. "Sir, I have updates from the other terminals. News of the incident has spread throughout the airport. We're receiving reports of similar discriminatory practices in Terminals 1, 2, and 5. Additionally, 3 other airlines have requested immediate meetings to review their own customer service protocols." Raymond nodded grimly. The cancer was deeper than even he had suspected. "Elena, schedule those meetings for this afternoon and contact the NAACP, the Anti-Defamation League, and the ACLU. It's time for external oversight of our internal reforms." The mention of civil rights organizations sent another wave of shocked murmur through the crowd. This wasn't just a corporate restructuring. This was a public acknowledgement of institutional discrimination and a commitment to transparent accountability. Jennifer Park, who had been live streaming the entire incident, spoke up from her position in the crowd. "Mr. Thompson, what message do you want to send to the thousands of people who are watching this right now?" Raymond looked directly into her phone's camera, his expression serious but hopeful. "The message is simple: dignity is not negotiable. Respect is not conditional. And access to services you've paid for should never depend on meeting someone else's prejudiced expectations of what you should look like." He paused, then continued with growing intensity. "But more than that, the message is that silence enables injustice. Every employee who knew what was happening and said nothing, every manager who ignored complaints, every passenger who watched discrimination happen and didn't speak up, all of you bear responsibility for allowing this culture to flourish." He looked around at the crowd, at the faces watching him with rapt attention. Today, that changes. Today, we stop tolerating intolerance. Today, we start building something better. The applause that erupted was different from what had come before. It was deeper, more sustained, and carried the sound of people who believed that real change was possible. But underneath the applause, Victoria Sterling stood alone in her designer clothes, surrounded by the wreckage of a career built on prejudice and the dawning realization that actions have consequences, even when those consequences take months or years to arrive. Especially then. Elena Vasquez's tablet chimed with an incoming message, and her expression grew more serious as she read it. She looked up at Raymond with the kind of look that preceded very bad news. "Sir, we have a problem. A bigger problem." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "Bigger than organized discrimination across multiple terminals." "Sir, I just received a report from our IT security team. They've been analyzing the passenger tracking system that Ms. Sterling implemented. It wasn't just informal, it was built into our computer systems." The crowd, which had been maintaining a steady murmur of conversation and commentary, went completely silent again. Even the background noise of airport announcements and rolling luggage seemed to fade as everyone strained to hear Elena's words. "Explain," Raymond said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded storms. Elena touched her tablet and began reading from what appeared to be a technical report. Ms. Sterling worked with IT systems manager Kevin Walsh to implement what they called a customer experience enhancement protocol. Passengers who were flagged for additional verification had special codes added to their profiles in our reservation system. She swiped to another screen. These codes triggered automatic alerts whenever these passengers attempted to book future flights, check in online, or approach service counters. The alerts instructed staff to provide what was termed elevated attention to these passengers. Diego Martinez stepped closer, his expression growing darker. "That's why some passengers seemed to have problems every time they came back. The system was targeting them." "Exactly," Elena confirmed. "We've identified 247 passenger profiles that were flagged with these codes. 91% of the flagged passengers are people of color. The remaining 9% appear to have been flagged for what the system notes describe as appearance inconsistencies or behavioral indicators." Amy Rodriguez looked at her phone, where she had been taking notes throughout the proceedings. "I remember Kevin Walsh attending some of those staff meetings. He took notes about the passengers we were supposed to flag." Raymond's expression had grown steadily colder as Elena provided more details. Now he looked at Victoria Sterling with the kind of stare that could freeze hellfire. "Ms. Sterling, you created a digital system to track and target passengers based on race. You built discrimination into our computer network." Victoria's remaining composure cracked completely. "It wasn't about race," she said desperately. "It was about maintaining standards, preventing fraud, ensuring customer satisfaction." "Stop lying," Raymond said, his voice cutting through her protests like a scalpel through skin. "Elena, show everyone what the system actually tracked." Elena swiped to another screen on her tablet and began reading. Passenger flag codes included AA-SUS for African American-Suspicious Lat- VER for Latino-. Verification required AP-Inc. for appearance inconsistent and BEC flag for behavioral flag. The crowd gasped audibly. Someone in the back shouted, "That's illegal." Another voice called out, "Sue them all." Jennifer Park's livestream comments were moving so fast, they were just a blur of outrage and demands for justice. But Elena wasn't finished. The system also tracked response times, noting when staff took longer than standard to process flagged passengers. Staff members who processed flagged passengers too quickly received automated reminders about thorough verification procedures. James Wilson, the security supervisor, stepped forward with a look of dawning horror on his face. "That's why I kept getting called for the same types of situations. The system was creating the problems that it then flagged as security concerns." "Correct," Elena said. What appeared to be individual incidents of suspicious behavior were actually the result of a coordinated system designed to make certain passengers appear problematic. Raymond looked around at the crowd of faces staring at him with a mixture of shock, anger, and expectation. These weren't just statistics on a report. These were real people who had been targeted, humiliated, and excluded by a digital system designed to discriminate while maintaining the appearance of legitimate security measures. Elena Raymond said, "I want that system dismantled immediately." Every flagged profile cleared, every discriminatory code removed, every automated alert disabled. "Already in progress, sir. IT is reverting the system to its pre-Sterling configuration. All passenger profiles will be restored to neutral status within the hour." Raymond nodded, then turned to address the crowd directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're learning today is that discrimination doesn't always look like someone shouting racial slurs or burning crosses. Modern discrimination is often hidden in policies buried in procedures and disguised as legitimate business practices." He gestured toward Victoria, who stood in stunned silence. Ms. Sterling didn't just decide one morning to start discriminating against passengers. She built a system, trained staff to implement it, and created technology to automate it. She turned prejudice into policy and bias into business practice. Diego stepped forward again. "Sir, how many other people knew about this system?" Elena consulted her tablet. Based on email records and system access logs, at least 23 employees had direct knowledge of the discriminatory coding system. This includes IT staff, customer service supervisors, and management personnel. Raymond was quiet for a long moment, processing the scope of what they were uncovering. Then he spoke with the kind of authority that comes from making decisions that will affect thousands of lives. "Elena, I want every employee who had knowledge of this system placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. I want their access revoked, their responsibilities transferred, and their actions reviewed by external investigators. Sir, that will affect nearly a quarter of our customer service operations across all terminals. Then, we'll rebuild customer service operations from scratch. We'll hire new people, implement new training, and create new systems. But we will not allow this culture of discrimination to continue for even one more day." The crowd erupted in applause again, but Raymond held up his hand for silence. He wasn't finished. "But individual accountability is only part of the solution. We need to understand how this system was allowed to flourish, how so many people either participated in it or ignored it, and how we can prevent it from ever happening again." Elena's tablet chimed again. She read the new message and looked up with an expression that was somehow both satisfied and grim. "Sir, I have an update from our legal department. They've been in contact with former employees who left the company during Ms. Sterling's tenure. We now have testimony from 7 former employees who say they were pressured to implement discriminatory practices and left rather than comply." "What kind of testimony?" Elena began reading from her tablet. Carlos Mendez, former customer relations specialist, states that he was fired for refusing to flag Latino passengers for additional verification. Maria Santos, former check-in supervisor, says she was demoted after complaints about discriminatory passenger tracking. David Torres, former training coordinator, claims he was forced to resign after objecting to appearance-based passenger profiling. Amy Rodriguez looked up from her phone where she had been taking notes. I remember Carlos. He was a good worker, always treated passengers with respect. When he was fired, Ms. Sterling said it was for failure to follow enhanced security protocols. Sarah Mitchell nodded vigorously. I remember him too. He was one of the best customer service reps we had. Passengers loved working with him because he made everyone feel welcome. Raymond's expression grew even more serious. Elena, get Carlos Mendez on the phone. I want to speak with him immediately. Elena made the call and handed the phone to Raymond. Carlos, this is Raymond Thompson, owner of Miami International Airport Holdings. I understand you were terminated for refusing to discriminate against passengers. Is that correct? Carlos's voice came through the phone clearly enough for nearby people to hear. Mr. Thompson, Yes, sir, that's correct. Miss Sterling told me I had to flag certain passengers for extra checks, and I couldn't do it. It was wrong, and I told her so. She fired me the next day. Carlos, how would you like your job back? With a promotion, back pay, and a new title as Director of Customer Equity. The silence on the phone lasted several heartbeats. Then, Carlos's voice came through thick with emotion. Sir, Yes, sir, I would very much like that. Report to Elena Vasquez's office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. You'll be leading the team that rebuilds our customer service culture from the ground up. Raymond handed the phone back to Elena and turned to face Victoria Sterling, who had been listening to this conversation with growing horror. Miss Sterling, do you understand what you've cost this company? Not just in legal liability, not just in reputation damage, but in human capital. You fired good people for refusing to be part of your discriminatory system. You drove away employees who could have helped us build something better. You created a culture where prejudice was rewarded and integrity was punished. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but Raymond held up a hand to stop her. You're no longer an employee here, Ms. Sterling. You have no standing to explain or defend your actions. But I want you to listen to what happens next, because I want you to understand the full scope of the damage you've caused and the effort it's going to take to repair it. He turned back to Elena. I want you to contact every employee who was terminated, demoted, or forced to resign during Ms. Sterling's tenure. Offer them their positions back with promotions and back pay. I want the people who stood up to discrimination to be the ones who help us build a system based on dignity and respect. Elena nodded and made notes on her tablet. Sir, should we also reach out to passengers who were affected by these discriminatory practices? Absolutely. I want letters sent to every passenger who filed a complaint that was ignored. I want apologies, I want compensations, and I want invitations for them to help us design better customer service protocols. Diego stepped forward. Sir, what about employees like me who saw what was happening but didn't speak up as loudly as we should have? Raymond looked at Diego with an expression that was stern but not without compassion. Diego, you defended me today when you thought I was just another passenger being discriminated against. You showed moral courage when it mattered. But you're right that all of us could have done more, said more, fought harder against injustice when we saw it happening. He looked around at the crowd. That's why what happens next isn't just about punishment. It's about education, about training, about creating a culture where speaking up against discrimination is not just encouraged but expected. Elena consulted her tablet again. Sir, I have one more update. The FAA has contacted us about the incident. They're initiating a civil rights investigation of our airport operations. Additionally, 3 news organizations have requested interviews, and the hashtag Airport Justice is trending nationally on social media. Raymond nodded grimly. The incident that had started with one woman's prejudice had revealed a web of institutional discrimination that would take months or years to fully unravel and reform. But that was what needed to happen. Elena scheduled the FAA interview for this afternoon. Accept all media requests. We're going to be completely transparent about what happened here and what we're doing to fix it. He looked around at the crowd one final time, at the faces of people who had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the exposure of discrimination, but the immediate and comprehensive response to it. Change is hard, Raymond said. Reform is painful. But tolerance of intolerance is complicity in injustice. And starting today, this airport chooses justice. 3 hours after Victoria Sterling was escorted from Terminal 3 by airport security, Raymond Thompson stood in the airport's main conference room, facing a table full of executives, managers, and supervisors, some nervous, some defiant, some quietly resigned to whatever consequences were about to fall on them. The conference room was a stark contrast to the public drama that had unfolded in the terminal. Here, floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the runways where planes took off and landed in an endless cycle of arrivals and departures. Here, decisions were made that affected thousands of passengers and hundreds of employees every single day. Elena Vasquez sat at Raymond's right side with her tablet and a stack of printed reports that represented the most comprehensive investigation of discrimination in the airport's 50-year history. To his left sat Dr. Patricia Morales from the University of Miami's Business Ethics Department, brought in to provide independent oversight of the proceedings. Across the table sat the people whose decisions had enabled Victoria Sterling's discriminatory system to flourish. Regional Manager Robert Blake, a 50-year-old man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. HR Director Patricia Hayes, whose usual confident demeanor had been replaced by nervous energy. Customer Relations Manager Janet Webb, who kept glancing at the door as if planning an escape, and IT Systems Manager Kevin Walsh, whose technical expertise had been used to automate prejudice. Ladies and gentlemen, Raymond began his voice carrying the kind of authority that made seasoned executives sit up straighter. We're here to address the most serious breach of civil rights policy in this airport's history. Over the past 3 hours, we've uncovered evidence of organized, intentional discrimination against passengers based on race, ethnicity, and perceived economic status. He gestured to Elena, who opened her tablet and began presenting their findings. The evidence includes recorded staff meetings where discriminatory policies were explicitly outlined, email communications, directing staff to profile passengers based on appearance computer system modifications designed to flag and track minority passengers, suppression of customer complaints alleging discrimination and retaliation against employees who refused to implement discriminatory practices. Robert Blake, the regional manager, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Raymond, I think there's been some misunderstanding about Mr. Blake. Raymond interrupted. You've been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation. You have no authority to speak on behalf of this company or to interpret its policies. You're here to answer questions, not to minimize or excuse what happened. The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, leaving Blake red-faced and silent. Raymond continued. Elena, please provide the specific details about Mr. Blake's role in suppressing employee complaints. Elena consulted her tablet. Mr. Blake received 14 formal complaints from employees regarding discriminatory practices over an 8-month period. 13 of these complaints specifically named Victoria Sterling as implementing policies that violated company anti-discrimination guidelines. She turned to another page. Mr. Blake's responses to these complaints were consistently dismissive. Quote, enhanced customer service verification is within management discretion. Quote, Appearance-based assessment is a standard security practice. Quote, employees who are uncomfortable with rigorous service standards may not be suitable for premium customer interface roles. Dr. Morales looked up from her own notes. Mr. Blake, these responses suggest that you not only ignored clear evidence of discrimination, but actively discouraged employees from reporting it. Is that accurate? Blake looked around the room as if searching for support, but found only stern faces waiting for his answer. I believed Ms. Sterling when she said these were legitimate customer service enhancements. I trusted her judgment. You trusted her judgment over the complaints of 14 different employees, Raymond asked. Yes. She was head of customer experience. It was her area of expertise. Elena consulted her tablet again. Mr. Blake, did you ever personally observe Miss Sterling's enhanced customer service procedures? Blake hesitated. I may have observed some interactions. Yes. I observed her directing certain passengers to additional verification processes. And what did you notice about these passengers? Blake's silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. They were predominantly minorities. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dr. Morales made notes while Elena marked something on her tablet. Raymond simply stared at Blake with an expression of profound disappointment. Mr. Blake, you observed racial profiling in action, received 14 employee complaints about it, and chose to classify it as enhanced customer service. Is that your testimony? I didn't think... No, Raymond said coldly. You didn't think. You didn't think about the passengers being humiliated. You didn't think about the employees being forced to participate in discrimination. You didn't think about the company's legal liability or moral obligations. You didn't think about anything except avoiding the inconvenience of addressing a problem. He turned to Elena. Mr. Blake's employment is terminated immediately. Security will escort him from the building. Blake stood up slowly, his face pale with shock. Raymond, you can't. I have a family, a mortgage, 20 years with this company. Mr. Blake, the passengers you allowed to be discriminated against also have families. The employees you silenced when they tried to report discrimination also have mortgages. Your 20 years with this company have just ended with the worst possible professional legacy. Raymond gestured to the security personnel waiting by the door. Please escort Mr. Blake out. As Blake was led away, Raymond turned his attention to Patricia Hayes, the HR director. Her usual confidence had evaporated, completely replaced by the nervous energy of someone who knew their career was about to end. Ms. Hayes, Raymond said you received copies of all 14 employee complaints that Mr. Blake dismissed. What did you do with them? Patricia Hayes looked down at her hands. I filed them according to company policy. Which policy was that? Unsubstantiated employee concerns about management decisions are filed without further action if the direct supervisor determines them to be unfounded. Helena leaned forward. Ms. Hayes, at what point did you personally investigate whether these complaints were substantiated or unsubstantiated? I relied on Mr. Blake's assessment. So, you never personally interviewed any of the 14 employees who filed complaints? No. You never observed the passenger interactions they were complaining about? No. You never reviewed the computer system modifications that were implementing discriminatory passenger tracking? Patricia Hayes looked up with surprise. I didn't know about computer system modifications. Elena touched her tablet and began reading. Ms. Hayes, you received email notifications about every passenger who was flagged in the discriminatory tracking system. Your email count shows 247 such notifications over 8 months. Each notification included the passenger's race, the reason for flagging, and the recommended enhanced verification procedures. The color drained from Patricia's face. I get hundreds of automated emails. I don't read them all in detail. Raymond leaned forward. Ms. Hayes, you're the HR director. It's your job to protect both employees and the company from discriminatory practices. You received 247 notifications about passengers being targeted based on race, and you claim you didn't notice I thought they were routine customer service notifications. Dr. Morales looked up from her notes. Ms. Hayes' routine customer service notifications don't typically include racial classifications. Did you never question why passenger race was being tracked in these communications? Patricia Hayes sat in silence for a long moment, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I knew something was wrong. But I thought if I didn't look too closely, I could avoid having to deal with it. The admission was like a knife through the heart of every principle HR was supposed to uphold. Raymond looked at Patricia Hayes with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for profound betrayals of trust. Ms. Hayes, your job was to deal with it. Your job was to protect employees from retaliation and passengers from discrimination. Your job was to ensure this company operated within legal and ethical boundaries. And you chose to look away because dealing with discrimination was inconvenient. He gestured to Elena. Ms. Hayes' employment is terminated immediately. As Patricia Hayes was escorted out, Raymond turned to the remaining executives. Customer Relations Manager Janet Webb and IT Systems Manager Kevin Walsh sat in stunned silence, watching their colleagues being fired in real time and wondering if they were next. Mr. Walsh Raymond said you built the discriminatory tracking system that Ms. Sterling designed. Walk me through your thought process. Kevin Walsh, a thin man in his 30s with nervous hands and thick glasses, looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Ms. Sterling said she needed enhanced customer tracking capabilities to improve service delivery and prevent fraud. Enhanced customer tracking based on race. She said appearance indicators were standard risk assessment protocols. Elena consulted her tablet. Mr. Walsh, you have a degree in computer science and 15 years of experience in database management. Did you never question why a customer service enhancement system required racial classification codes? Walsh shifted uncomfortably. I asked about it. Ms. Sterling said it was based on TSA behavioral assessment guidelines. Did you verify that with TSA number? Did you research whether racial profiling was legal in customer service contexts? No. Did you consult with legal or HR before implementing racial tracking codes? No. Raymond leaned back in his chair, studying Walsh with the kind of attention usually reserved for particularly interesting problems. Mr. Walsh, you built a system that automatically flagged passengers based on race and generated alerts to discriminate against them. You did this without legal review, without verification of claimed authorities, and without questioning whether it was ethical or legal. Why? Walsh was quiet for nearly a minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with shame. Because Ms. Sterling was my supervisor, and I was afraid of losing my job if I questioned her too much. And now you're going to lose your job for not questioning her enough? Raymond replied. Mr. Walsh, technical expertise without moral courage is a dangerous combination. Your employment is terminated, but I want you to understand why. You weren't fired for following orders. You were fired for building systems of oppression and never asking if you should. As Kevin Walsh was escorted out, only Janet Webb remained at the table. She had been silent throughout the proceedings, watching her colleagues fired one by one, calculating her own chances of survival. Ms. Webb Raymond said you're the customer relations manager. Multiple employees have testified that you implemented Ms. Sterling's discriminatory policies in your department. What's your response? Janet Webb, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled hair and a professional demeanor that was beginning to crack under pressure, straightened in her chair. Mr. Thompson, I implemented enhanced customer service protocols as directed by Ms. Sterling. I believed them to be legitimate business practices. Enhanced customer service protocols that disproportionately affected minority passengers. The protocols were based on appearance and behavioral indicators, not race. Elena touched her tablet. Ms. Webb, in your staff meeting on November 20th, you told your team to pay special attention to urban passengers and ethnic customers. How do those terms relate to appearance and behavioral indicators? Janet Webb's professional composure finally cracked completely. Those were just... I was trying to help my staff understand how to discriminate more effectively. Raymond stood up from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the runways. Planes continued to take off and land carrying passengers who trusted that they would be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. Miss Webb, he said without turning around, your employment is also terminated. But I want you to understand something before you leave. Every person you taught to discriminate will now have to unlearn those lessons. Every passenger you targeted will remember how they were treated. Every employee you pressured to participate in discrimination has been damaged by what you asked them to do. He turned back to face her. The harm you've caused extends far beyond your own career. You've corrupted the work environment, degraded the passenger experience, and turned customer service into a tool of oppression. That damage will take years to repair. As Janet Webb was escorted out, Raymond returned to his seat and looked at Elena and Dr. Morales. How many more? Elena consulted her tablet. Based on our investigation, we have evidence of knowing participation or willful blindness involving 31 additional employees across 6 departments. Recommendations range from termination to mandatory retraining, depending on the level of involvement. Raymond nodded grimly. Implement those recommendations, all of them. And Elena. Yes, sir. I want Carlos Mendez and the other employees who were fired for refusing to discriminate brought back immediately. They showed moral courage when it mattered. Now we need them to help us rebuild. Dr. Morales looked up from her notes. Mr. Thompson, this level of comprehensive reform is unprecedented in the aviation industry. How do you plan to maintain operations while rebuilding your entire customer service culture? Raymond smiled for the first time in hours. Dr. Morales, we're going to do it the same way you eat an elephant. One bite at a time. But we're going to do it right, we're going to do it transparently, and we're going to make sure it never needs to be done again. 1 week after the Terminal 3 incident, Raymond Thompson stood in the same conference room, but everything else had changed. The table was now surrounded by a different group of people, civil rights attorneys, passenger advocacy representatives, community leaders, and the employees who had been terminated for refusing to discriminate now returned as the architects of a new culture. Carlos Mendez, the former customer relations specialist who had been fired for refusing to profile Latino passengers, now sat at the table wearing a badge that read, Director of Customer Equity. His calm confidence and genuine warmth had made him an instant hit with both employees and passengers during his first week back. Beside him sat Maria Santos, the former check-in supervisor who had been demoted for objecting to discriminatory practices, now serving as manager of service excellence. David Torres was the new training coordinator for ethical customer service. Dr. Patricia Morales had been joined by representatives from the NAACP, the Anti-Defamation League, and the Hispanic Federation. Their presence wasn't just ceremonial, they would have ongoing oversight authority to ensure reforms were implemented and maintained. Ladies and gentlemen, Raymond began. 1 week ago, we uncovered the most comprehensive discrimination scheme in this airport's history. Today, we're implementing the most comprehensive reform program in the aviation industry's history. Elena Vasquez, now carrying the title of Senior Vice President of Operations and Reform, opened her presentation on the tablet. The Thompson Equity Initiative represents a complete reconstruction of how this airport approaches passenger services employee training and organizational accountability. She touched the tablet and began outlining the program. First, we've established the Customer Dignity Promise. Every passenger who enters this airport will be treated with respect, courtesy, and fairness, regardless of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, economic status, or appearance. Carlos Mendez leaned forward. Sir, we've had over 40 employees volunteer to be part of the Customer Dignity Ambassador program. These are staff members who will receive specialized training in recognizing and preventing discrimination, and who will have direct reporting authority to flag potential bias incidents. Maria Santos added, "We've also created passenger advocacy positions at every terminal. These are employees whose sole job is to ensure passengers receive appropriate service and to intervene when problems arise." Raymond nodded approvingly. "What about the technology infrastructure that enabled the discrimination?" Elena consulted her notes. "We've completely rebuilt the customer tracking system. Passenger profiles now include only information relevant to travel safety and logistics. Any attempt to add demographic information for non-security purposes triggers automatic alerts to executive leadership and external oversight." David Torres opened his own tablet. "The training program has been completely redesigned. Every customer-facing employee now receives 40 hours of anti-discrimination training, unconscious bias education, and cultural competency development. This training is mandatory and must be renewed annually." Dr. Morales looked up from her notes. "Mr. Thompson, these reforms are impressive in scope, but how do you ensure they're actually implemented and not just written policies that get ignored?" Raymond smiled. "Dr. Morales, that's where our external oversight partners come in. The NAACPADL and Hispanic Federation will have full access to our systems, our training programs, and our complaint processes. They can conduct surprise audits, interview employees and passengers, and require immediate corrective action." Janet Williams from the NAACP leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, we appreciate the oversight authority, but we're also interested in proactive measures. What are you doing to prevent discrimination, rather than just responding to it after it happens?" Carlos answered. "Ms. Williams, we've implemented what we call dignity checks at every service point. Employees are trained to ask themselves 3 questions before every passenger interaction. Am I making assumptions based on appearance? Am I providing the same level of service I would to any other passenger? Would I be comfortable if my interaction was recorded and reviewed?" Maria added, "We've also created anonymous reporting systems where employees can flag concerns about colleague behavior or passenger treatment. These reports go directly to the Customer Equity Office and external oversight, bypassing the management chain that previously suppressed complaints." Rabbi Sarah Cohen from the Anti-Defamation League raised her hand. "What about passengers who were affected by the previous discriminatory practices? Are you reaching out to them?" Elena nodded. "We've identified 247 passengers who were flagged in the discriminatory tracking system, plus an estimated 600 additional passengers who filed complaints or experienced documented bias incidents. Each is receiving a personal letter of apology compensation for their experience and an invitation to participate in our reform process." "What kind of participation?" asked Miguel Rivera from the Hispanic Federation. Raymond stood and walked to the window overlooking the terminals. "Mr. Rivera, we're creating a passenger advisory council with representatives from every community that was targeted by our discriminatory practices. This council will have quarterly meetings with Executive Leadership Review Authority over policy changes and veto power over customer service procedures that could enable bias. He turned back to the room. But more than that, we're acknowledging that the harm done by institutional discrimination can't be repaired with policies alone. We need to rebuild trust through consistent action over time. David Torres opened his training materials. That's why our employee training doesn't just focus on what not to do. It focuses on proactive inclusion, cultural appreciation, and recognition that diversity makes us stronger as an organization and as a community. Carlos pulled out his phone and showed a photo. Yesterday, I had a passenger, an elderly black gentleman carrying an old suitcase just like Mr. Thompson was. Under the old system, he would have been flagged for additional screening. Under our new procedures, he was greeted with respect, processed efficiently, and thanked for choosing our airport. His smile when he boarded his plane reminded me why we're doing this work. Maria nodded enthusiastically. The response from employees has been overwhelmingly positive. People want to do good work, treat passengers well, and be part of an organization they can be proud of. When you remove the pressure to discriminate and replace it with support for excellence, amazing things happen. Dr. Morales looked up from her notes. Mr. Thompson, what's your timeline for full implementation of these reforms? Raymond returned to his seat. Dr. Morales, the basic infrastructure changes technology oversight. Reporting systems are already in place. The training program rolls out over the next 90 days. But cultural change takes longer. We expect to see measurable improvement in passenger satisfaction and employee confidence within 6 months, and sustained cultural transformation within 2 years. Elena consulted her tablet. We're also tracking specific metrics: passenger complaint rates, employee turnover in customer service roles, diversity in hiring and promotion, and satisfaction scores across different demographic groups. What about accountability? Asked Janet Williams. How do you prevent this from happening again in 5 years with different managers? Raymond leaned forward. Miss Williams, that's the most important question. We're building accountability into every level of the organization. Discrimination prevention is now part of every manager's performance evaluation. Customer equity metrics are part of executive compensation, and our external oversight partners have the authority to require immediate changes if problems emerge. Carlos added, but the real accountability comes from changing the culture so that discrimination is no longer possible to hide or ignore. When everyone is trained to recognize it, empowered to report it, and supported for speaking up about it, it becomes much harder for biased practices to take root. Rabbi Cohen raised another question. What about the industry more widely? Are other airports and airlines implementing similar reforms? Helena smiled. Rabbi Cohen, we've received inquiries from 37 airports and 23 airlines requesting information about our reform program. The FAA has asked us to present our model as a potential industry standard, and 3 universities are studying our implementation process for their business ethics and public policy programs. Raymond stood again. The goal isn't just to fix our own problems. It's to prove that comprehensive reform is possible, practical, and profitable. Discrimination is bad for business. It drives away customers, demoralizes employees, and creates legal liability. Organizations that embrace equity and inclusion perform better by every metric that matters. Miguel Rivera leaned back in his chair. Mr. Thompson, this is impressive, but I'm curious about something personal. What did this experience teach you about leadership? Raymond was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Mr. Rivera, it taught me that leaders don't just make policies, they create cultures. And cultures can enable justice or injustice, dignity or discrimination, inclusion or exclusion. As leaders, we're responsible not just for what we personally do, but for what we allow to happen on our watch. He looked around the room at the faces of people who were working to build something better. It also taught me that change is possible, but only when people have the courage to speak up, stand up, and demand better. The passengers who recorded the discrimination, the employees who refused to participate, the advocates who held us accountable. They made this transformation possible. Dr. Morales closed her notebook. Mr. Thompson, you've created a model for institutional reform that addresses both immediate accountability and long-term cultural change. What's your message for other organizations facing similar challenges? Raymond walked back to the window looking out at the planes taking off and landing carrying passengers who now experienced a different kind of airport than they had just 1 week earlier. The message is simple, he said. Discrimination is a choice. Equity is a choice. Justice is a choice. And every day, in every interaction, in every policy decision, organizations choose what kind of culture they want to create and what kind of values they want to embody. He turned back to the room. We chose justice. And we're just getting started. 3 months after Victoria Sterling's firing sent shockwaves through Miami International Airport, Raymond Thompson stood in the same terminal where the incident had begun. But Terminal 3 looked different now. Not just physically, though there were new signs and information displays in multiple languages, but energetically. The atmosphere hummed with a different kind of energy, one built on dignity rather than discrimination. The old marble counter where Victoria had humiliated Raymond was still there, but it was now staffed by Carlos Mendez's hand-picked team of customer dignity ambassadors. Behind the counter, a small placard read, "Every passenger deserves respect. Every story matters. Every person has dignity." Raymond carried his father's worn leather suitcase as he walked through the terminal just as he had 3 months earlier. But this time, every employee who saw him smiled and nodded with genuine warmth, not because he was the owner, but because they recognized him as the man who had stood up for dignity when it mattered most. The suitcase itself had become something of a symbol throughout the airport. Not because it was displayed in a museum case. Raymond had refused that suggestion, but because employees understood what it represented. It stood for the idea that a person's worth wasn't measured by the newness of their belongings or the cost of their clothes, but by the content of their character and the dignity inherent in every human being. Jennifer Park, the University of Miami student whose live stream had captured the original incident, was waiting near Gate B7 with her camera equipment. Her original video had been viewed over 3 million times, spawning dozens of articles, academic studies, and corporate policy reviews across the aviation industry. "Mr. Thompson," she called out as Raymond approached, "are you ready for the interview?" Raymond smiled and nodded. "Jennifer, you can call me Raymond. And yes, I'm ready." Jennifer set up her equipment and began the interview that would become the capstone to her documentary about institutional discrimination and corporate reform. Raymond, 3 months ago, you experienced public humiliation at this very airport. Today, you're standing here as the person who led the most comprehensive reform of discriminatory practices in aviation history. What does that transformation mean to you? Raymond set his father's suitcase down and looked around at the terminal, buzzing with diverse passengers being served by diverse employees, all interacting with the kind of mutual respect that should have always been standard, but had instead become revolutionary. Jennifer, it means that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can become the catalyst for the best changes we can make. My humiliation at this counter wasn't just about me. It was about every person who has ever been judged by their appearance, dismissed because of their accent, or excluded because they didn't meet someone else's narrow definition of who belongs where. Elena Vasquez approached from the direction of the administration office's tablet in hand as always, but her expression was one of satisfaction rather than crisis management. "Sir, She said, though by now the formality was affectionate rather than distant. "I have the quarterly report you requested." Elena opened her tablet and began reading. Customer satisfaction scores are up 47% across all demographic groups. Employee retention in customer service roles has increased by 52%. Discrimination complaints have decreased by 89%, and positive feedback specifically mentioning dignified treatment has increased by 340%. She swiped to another screen. More importantly, we've had 37 other airports implement versions of our reform model, and the FAA has cited our program as the new industry standard for bias prevention and customer equity. Diego Martinez walked over from his supervisory position at the baggage handling area. 3 months earlier, he had been a baggage handler with a strong sense of justice, but no platform to express it. Now, he wore a badge that read Customer Dignity Advocate and split his time between baggage operations and passenger advocacy. Raymond Diego said, "I wanted you to know yesterday I helped a family that was having trouble with their documentation. Under the old system, they would have been flagged, delayed, and treated like potential criminals. Under our new procedures, we identified the issue, helped them resolve it, and made sure they felt welcomed throughout the process." Diego's smile was broad and genuine. The father thanked me and said it was the first time he'd traveled without fear of being discriminated against. That's what this reform means to families like his. Dr. Patricia Morales approached the group carrying her own notebook filled with observations from her ongoing assessment of the airport's transformation. As the independent ethics oversight coordinator, she had unlimited access to observe operations, interview employees, and assess the effectiveness of reform measures. "Raymond," she said, "I've just completed my quarterly assessment. The cultural transformation is remarkable, but what strikes me most is that it's sustainable. Employees aren't just following new policies, they're embracing new values. The change goes deeper than compliance." Amy Rodriguez, now promoted to manager of passenger experience, walked over from her station at the information desk. 3 months earlier, she had been a nervous young employee, afraid to speak up. Now, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her voice mattered. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I wanted to share something. This morning, I helped an elderly gentleman who was carrying an old briefcase and wearing clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. 3 months ago, that interaction would have triggered Victoria's protocols. Today, it triggered our hospitality protocols." Amy's eyes lit up as she continued. "It turns out he was a retired teacher, traveling to visit his grandchildren. He told me that airline staff usually made him feel unwelcome, but today he felt seen and valued. That's the difference between the old culture and the new one." Raymond picked up his father's suitcase and looked at the small group of people who had become partners in creating something unprecedented, a complete transformation of institutional culture in real time under public scrutiny with lasting results. "What you're all describing," Raymond said, "is exactly what my father would have wanted to see in this airport. He worked here for 30 years, cleaning floors and emptying trash cans, being treated as invisible by people who thought his uniform made him less important than their business suits." Raymond's voice grew stronger as he continued. "He carried this suitcase to work every day because it held his dreams for what this place could become, a place where every person who walked through these doors was treated with dignity, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from." Jennifer adjusted her camera to capture Raymond's words. "What message do you want to send to other organizations that are struggling with institutional discrimination?" Raymond looked directly into the camera, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven that transformation was possible. "The message is that change requires courage, but courage is contagious. It took courage for employees to speak up about discrimination they witnessed. It took courage for passengers to record and report their experiences. It took courage to admit that our systems were broken and commit to rebuilding them completely." He gestured around at the terminal. But the most important message is that this work is never finished. Creating an inclusive culture isn't a project you complete, it's a commitment you renew every day in every interaction with every person who trusts you with their dignity. Elena consulted her tablet one final time. Raymond, I have one more update. We just received confirmation that Miami International has been selected to host the first national conference on aviation equity and inclusion. Representatives from every major airport and airline in the country will be coming here to learn from our reform model. Raymond smiled at the irony. 3 months earlier, this airport had been an example of how discrimination could flourish in institutional settings. Now, it was becoming a model for how justice could be implemented and sustained. Elena, make sure Carlos and his team lead the conference presentations. The people who lived through the discrimination and helped design the solutions should be the ones teaching others how to create change. As the interview concluded and the group began to disperse back to their responsibilities, Raymond stood alone for a moment in the spot where Victoria Sterling had tried to humiliate him. He thought about the passengers who had been discriminated against before him, the employees who had been silenced when they tried to speak up, and the culture of exclusion that had been allowed to flourish in the name of standards and security. Then he thought about the thousands of passengers who would walk through this terminal in the coming months and years, who would be treated with dignity, not because policies required it, but because people believed they deserved it. He thought about the employees who came to work each day knowing they were part of something meaningful, something that made the world a little more just. Raymond picked up his father's suitcase and walked toward the exit past the memorial plaque that had been installed near the old check-in counter. It read, "In memory of James Thompson and all who work with dignity, travel with hope, and believe that respect is not negotiable." But the final words on the plaque captured the real legacy of what had happened in Terminal 3. Justice isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something better than what came before. As Raymond walked out into the Miami sunshine, travelers of every background, every color, every economic status continued to move through the terminal behind him, all of them carrying their own stories, their own dreams, their own dignity. And for the first time in the airport's 50-year history, the building itself seemed to honor those stories rather than judge them. Sometimes, transformation begins with one person refusing to accept injustice. But it succeeds when entire communities choose to build justice together, one interaction at a time, one day at a time, until dignity becomes as common as breathing, and respect becomes as automatic as greeting. The revolution. Raymond Thompson started with a worn suitcase, and quiet courage had become something larger than any individual. It had become a culture, a commitment, and a promise that every person who entered these doors would be seen, valued, and respected for exactly who they were. And that promise, carved in policies, embedded in training, and lived out in daily practice, would outlast any individual leader, any single incident, or any moment of crisis. It had become part of the foundation upon which the future would be built, stronger, fairer, and more beautiful than what had come before.
If this story moved you and you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they look like, please hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, because stories like this only create change when they reach the people who need to hear them most. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we are bringing you more real stories of justice, courage, and transformation every week. Sometimes the most powerful revolution starts with a single person standing up for what's right. Remember, the person next to you carrying a worn suitcase might be carrying the dreams that will change the world. Let's make sure that they never have to fight alone. Thank you for watching, and thank you for believing that dignity isn't negotiable and respect isn't conditional. See you in the next story. This story was written and produced with the support of artificial intelligence. Audio narration is AI generated. All video footage consists of stock video and images. Any resemblance to real event, real name, real location, or real individual is pure coincidental and entirely unintentional.